Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our presentation. So when we were thinking about the topic of microaggression, one of the things that we really needed to do is to dive deeper into the subject and the ramifications of microaggression. So critical lens is really needed in how to address the topic within the schools. So there were four main areas that we looked at. One is unconscious bias, and that's really microaggression that may be seen as potential problem in schools because administrators and teachers may unintentionally perpetrate policies, beliefs, and ideas that appear unfair to diverse groups of students based on ethnicity, race, culture, due to unconscious or implicit bias. Awareness was another area, and that's really the movement of microaggression. So it's being aware in how individuals communicate with other people within or outside of a diverse community. Modification of behavior, those are acts of engagement that may be perceived as prejudicial or embedded in implicit bias. Social interaction and behaviors of how individuals engage and communicate collectively in small groups or one-on-one is learned and can easily be modified if attention is brought to the specific instance and issue. And lastly, communication. So this is within the classroom. Microaggressive behaviors can be the launching pad for in-depth conversations, awareness, and practices to learn how new and appropriate means of communication between diverse populations who make up the school community. Next slide, please. So we want to share with you the definitions of microaggression. So Sue, who is one of the seminal authors in the area of microaggression, defines it as thus. It's brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative prejudicial slights and insults towards any group. Microaggression can be unconscious behavior that is perpetrated by one or more persons within a group and may be deemed offensive and unwelcome. The perpetrator may or may not be aware that he or she is committing the microaggressive behavior. Next slide, please. So the problem that we were looking at is really based on these specific areas. So first was assumptions and stereotypes, and these are made about students based on ethnicity, race, and culture. Before schools attempt to discuss the topic of microaggression with students, schools must first address microaggressive practices that exist within the school culture and that may encompass current school practices. Schools should operate with awareness of inequities that may be prevalent and work to dismantle systems that impact student intellectual and social growth. School leaders must clarify how the vision, mission, and values, and also the priorities of the school should change in order to support students appropriately to reduce the occurrences of microaggressive behaviors. Little is known about the impact of microaggressive behaviors in the K-12 classroom, and there needs to be acknowledgement in action of microaggressive behaviors in the classroom, and those may be due to teachers not being aware if such conduct is taking place within the classroom. Teachers may not be afforded the resources to properly address student equality and equitably when confronted with such situations. I'd like to turn over the presentation to Andrea. Next slide, please.
Yes. That being said, the purpose of this study, which happens to be a qualitative narrative inquiry, was really to determine how microaggressive behaviors, as they're as they're observed by teachers in the K-12 classroom, are being addressed. We discovered in the literature that bullying as a concept was very well known and very well understood as a form of violent and abusive behavior. But microaggression, especially the way that it appears in school environments, was not so well understood. We also felt that it was important to mention here that there may be a possible role of social media or other means of technology communication that is allowing, if not enabling, microaggression to flourish. It wasn't a specific topic in our study, but we felt like it is important for that to at least be mentioned here. What we do know is that children and adolescents are subjected to behaviors that can be deemed as microaggression while they are at school. And we hope that this study would shed some light on why microaggressive behaviors are occurring in the K-12 environment, how teachers can recognize these behaviors as acts of violence towards others, and also be able to suggest some strategies for intervention at the classroom and at the school levels. And we can advance to the next slide. This brought up our two research questions. First, what are the decision-making processes of teachers in the classroom when addressing issues of microaggression? And second, what policies and procedures are in place that mitigate microaggressive behaviors in schools? Next slide, please. The significance of our study can be put into four general categories. First, the idea that behaviors like microaggression need to be kept in check within the school environment. Schools are communities in which microaggressive behaviors may flourish, especially if they're left unchecked. Another concept that's significant to our study is that we can't tolerate offensive behaviors. Students should be made aware of microaggression and offered guidance at an early age so that to know that communication that is offensive towards others based upon race, ethnicity, or other cultural groups should not be tolerated, or worse yet, it should not be ignored. We need to be agents of change. Administrators and classroom teachers can be agents of change with respect to microaggression in the classroom. Administrators and classroom teachers can develop strategic policies that are inclusive and diverse to ensure that microaggressive behaviors can be stopped or immediately addressed. And finally, with the guidance and awareness that we present here in this study may offer some guidance and bring awareness in the understanding of the patterns of microaggression that would support teachers in the classroom, inclusive of schools and school districts from urban, suburban, and rural regions. So we really wanted to have a bit of a wide-reaching significance for our study. And we can move on to the next slide. The background information. Pervasive behaviors. Microaggression is a form of a pervasive behavior that occurs in schools. But unfortunately, educators may not realize that those behaviors are happening in their classrooms. Teachers need to become more aware of microaggressive behaviors because those microaggressive behaviors can result in negative outcomes that may be harmful to their students. We know too that microaggression and bullying tend to see a large overlap. The individuals may think that the term microaggression is similar to the term bullying, but microaggression is not the same as bullying. The term microaggression was actually introduced by Pierce and colleagues dating back to 1978 in a study that was conducted about racial discrimination specifically. With regard to people of color, microaggression is often associated with the concept of discrimination towards people of color. And it's mostly because it's been shown that people of color tend to be the ones who most often will report these behaviors to other people. There's a key distinction, however, between bullying and microaggression. And it's important to understand that distinction specifically as it relates to microaggression, bullying, and discrimination. These are behaviors that have different intents, especially from the person who is initiating the offensive behavior. There's also with microaggression a focus on the other that does end up extending beyond just the category of race. In 2007, research began to emerge which changed the focus of microaggression so that it was not simply a race-based aggression, but also to include hostility in targeting religious groups, mental health differences, sexual orientation, gender, and other aspects of culture. We can move to the next slide. Thus, the theoretical framework for this study really is based in microaggression theory. It's based upon the perception and the experience of the individual. A behavior isn't considered microaggressive based on how it makes others feel or how it changes those individuals' experiences and engagement in activities within the world. As Cheryl mentioned earlier, Sue was one of the pioneers in the area of developing the theory of microaggression and understanding microaggression as a unique concept. Sue really brought microaggression theory into the mainstream by presenting it as an experiential reality. It's grounded in the truth of the individual who is targeted by the acts of microaggression. Most importantly, microaggression must be viewed holistically, and as such, awareness of microaggression and its effects are essential to addressing it. You can move to the next slide. Just a basic literature review to tie everything together. In the literature, there's a definite focus on the target group. Whitner et al. In 2017 indicated that individuals that appear different in terms of ethnicity, sexual orientation, beliefs, and other areas are often the target for microaggression. Microaggressions are unwanted behaviors. Forrest, Bank, and Jensen back in 2015 found that unwanted behaviors during students' childhood years even negatively impacted their experiences in their adult life, suggesting that there may be a long-term element to the experience of microaggression and the behaviors that may go along with it. It's also important to note that microaggression can represent a form of ongoing violence. And this was specifically brought up by Rafi and Walling in 2016, when they pointed out that there was ongoing violence that's perpetuated in the LGBTQIQ+ community. Again, it was pointing out the need to understand microaggression from a broad perspective and not within one community only. Microaggression is based in disparate treatment. In the context of the study by Rafi and Walling, the students that were in that study experienced being treated differently because of how they looked or behaved. So even if the students' behaviors are accepted at home, the traditional school environment may not be able to accept and tolerate those behaviors as readily. Thus, understanding microaggression in schools from the perspectives of teachers is where our study steps in. And Cheryl, you can take it from here and advance to the next slide.
All right, thank you, Andrea. So the population for our study consisted of 5 K through 12 educators that represented a very diverse and culturally diverse school district in Northern California. These teachers were in elementary, middle, and high school, and we did not have gender as a requirement for choosing the participants. Just as long as they met the selection criteria, they were able to participate in the study. Next slide, please. So the method of our study was a qualitative based in narrative inquiry, and we used a convenient sample to actually work with our participants. And the reason why we chose narrative inquiry, because we really wanted to hear their stories. We wanted to hear what they were experiencing, what they were observing, and it allows for honesty and vulnerability in sharing those observations. And that really gave us a richness of the experiences that they were having. The study participants then shared the relevant experiences in the classroom, and they were able to really express the depths and the pains and the struggles that their students may be experiencing when such behaviors of microaggression occur to them, either individually or as a group. Next slide, please. So our data collection and analysis, we did a semi-structured open-ended interviews, and this provided for a lot of flexibility. The premise of the study was to gather the experience and the observations of the teachers who have actually witnessed microaggression within the classroom, and also to understand the decision-making processes that they employ to address each of the instances that they had witnessed. We went through the traditional methods of transcribing the interviews. Those were member checked. And then as a team, we went through and cross-checked. We were looking for consistency of coding. And then from there, we were able to develop the key content and our themes. Next slide, please. So our emergent themes based on our findings were that there's an awareness and recognition of microaggression as related to bullying, microaggression as degrading behavior directed towards others, and that microaggression within the school discipline framework will need to be addressed. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to limit the number of quotations that are included in our findings. We have actually submitted our paper for publication, and within our paper we have much more detailed findings from each of the participants. So if you could go on to the next slide. So our first category was awareness and recognition. And this is just one of the quotes from Kate, who is a high school teacher. And I'm just gonna read part of it. So she was saying that, you know, boys, particularly boys, are not being very sensitive to other people in the classroom. And they may not say anything, but this is definitely something that she had to work through during the school year, that she was always very concerned about the health, not just the physical health of her students, but also the emotional, social, mental health and wellness issues of when students were actually engaging in microaggression, aggressive behaviors. One of the things that I do want to say about all our teachers that we did find in a general context was when we asked the teachers specifically for a definition of microaggression, they did not have a collective understanding of exactly what the definition was. But when the definition was brought to them, the light bulbs went off and they're like, oh yeah, that's what I see. So then they were able to share their stories readily with us. Next slide, please. So interactions with other people that were not like them. So we saw some different things, elementary school and middle school. So in middle school, if parents and guardians, they are so important to be able to model appropriate interactions with other people that do not look like them, and they need to do that with respect. So when students or children are able to see how their parents are able to interact with people that are different, then their children will be able to model that same behavior at school. So that's one of the things that had come up often in this particular category. Next slide, please. So recognition of others. So one of the things that was very important was between all the teachers was that they wanted to make sure that the students, or their observations of students, was that they were able to recognize that other individuals are different based on their culture. And when you have diversity in the classroom, sometimes that is how students interact. They're just not quite sure how to interact with someone who looks different than themselves. And therefore, sometimes they're not very mature as far as how their interaction occurs. And so one of the things that Mary had mentioned was we need to develop policies that embrace diversity and call this out when it's happening. We need to teach and inform parents and guardians that how they speak and react to others is modeled behavior. So what the teachers were really asking for was, you know, we have all these policies in place with how to deal with bullying, but we do not have policies in place for microaggressive behaviors and how to handle those similarly across all grade levels. Next slide. Degrading behavior. So Dan was a high school teacher, and one of the things that he was saying was, you know, he wants to let them know that what the students are saying, even if they think it's innocent, such as the phrase, "you're so gay," and that was a phrase that's still around in high schools, but it's actually offensive. And one of the things that was really important was the fact that the students didn't know that Dan is actually identifies as a homosexual man. So even though the phrase is an innocent phrase, he also finds that offensive. So most of the students don't realize that these things are hurtful and they're just trying to blend in with the crowd. But being cool doesn't mean that you're being insensitive, and the students don't really understand that. Next slide, please. So school policies and discipline. So Mary, who's a middle school teacher, is saying we really need to teach and inform parents and guardians on how they speak and react to others, this model behavior, as we mentioned before. And that is so important. And Kate further described the fact that they need guidelines to have bullying to be extended into microaggression. So when there is a progressive discipline in most schools now, we need to make sure that microaggression is that lower level discipline that's being addressed before it escalates into bullying type of behaviors. And she also believed that in her school that they need to have a sit down with the staff to define what is microbullying and what is microaggressive behaviors. What do those look like? So everybody is aware at their school site. And then also when they're able to do that, then they have the ability to develop school policies and school discipline codes to address that collectively. Next slide, please.
We do have just about 5 minutes left before Q&A.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So when we're looking at the support with discipline framework, Anne, who's an elementary teacher, was saying the administration does discuss bullying, and they have lots of anti-bullying campaigns on campus during the school year. What they need to do is really extend that into microaggressive behaviors, something that she wanted to talk to the principal about. And students, especially at the elementary level, are sponges. And they need to know exactly how to behave. And students at that age want to please their teachers, and they want to engage with each other, but they have to do so properly. So I'd like to advance the slide and then have Andrea take us to the end.
Sure. Now, how did we boil all of this down together to really understand what we had learned from our participants? First and foremost, we learned that the teachers in our case, this small group of teachers that were part of our study, were not familiar with the concept of microaggression, even though, as we know, microaggression is not a new concept. So it was a bit surprising to us to see that the teachers, these teachers across the board, were not fully versed in the topic as opposed to and distinct from the idea of bullying. But they obviously, since they were able to recall events that they had witnessed, they seemed to witness bullying and identify bullying more in the classroom as opposed to microaggression. But when the teachers were asked to describe microaggression within that framework of the definition that they were given, they tended to come up with things, more bullying type behaviors among their students that would fit into the microaggression category. So our teachers do tend to continue to mix the concepts of microaggression and bullying as if they are the same. They don't necessarily differentiate between the two things. And it could be, most likely is because the teachers are not really familiar with microaggression as its own independent concept, especially within the context of the school discipline policy. Microaggression as an independent concept probably isn't discussed in the classroom or within the school community, which really makes it difficult to identify the behavior as microaggression. So many teachers, especially those in the study, may have witnessed microaggression in the classroom, but they don't necessarily have a framework or a concept for identifying those behaviors independent of the concept of bullying. So ultimately, understanding what microaggression is and how it is different from bullying could provide teachers and administrators with better insight about this topic. We can advance to the next slide. That brings us to our recommendations. One of our recommendations is really to explore the various phenomena that fall under the umbrella of microaggression in different settings, specifically singular settings, to look to see if there may be differences across different settings within the K-12 environment. Based upon our results, one thing that really rose to the top was the idea that elementary schools may need to be looked at as one of those specific settings. The elementary teachers in our study had some unique perspectives that seemed to be a bit different from middle school and high school teachers. And those especially linked back to the idea of childhood development and maturity. Another thing that we think might be necessary is a study on microaggression looking across the genders. And this would be inclusive of concepts including gender identity, not just our typical boy-girl in the classroom setting type of concept around gender, but to look at gender more inclusively and see how microaggression may be different across the various gender identities. Future studies could also explore microaggression in more quantitative terms. Our study was qualitative. We wanted to hear the narrative experiences of these teachers, the rich description. But quantitative studies might help us to understand the rate or the incidence and intensity of microaggression as it's occurring in these various settings. There also seems to be a need, and this was something that our teachers actually brought up themselves. There's a need for specific strategies for both teachers and administrators so that they can deal with microaggressions in the classroom more effectively. We can advance to the next slide. And some reflections to connect back to our main concept around social change for this conference. Our study helped to solidify the perspective that the language that we use with each other to communicate really affects those interactions. We need to be aware of the words that we use, that they're important, and ensure that we're relying on inclusive language so that we can create a positive environment with our words. And nothing can be more important than doing that in our schools. In schools specifically, the students also need to be made aware of the importance of language. That will include teaching students how to use more neutral, thoughtful language that's just demonstrating respect for others. We also need to teach to ourselves and teach others to avoid words that may be viewed by others as offensive, insulting, or alienating. And as Cheryl brought up from the perspective of our teacher, Dan, we need to think about what the other person sees and hears in our words and actions. And that really requires us to strengthen our ability to take the perspective of someone else. And finally, when we describe and refer to other people, we need to focus on individuals rather than differences or disabilities. Ultimately, we are all unique and valuable human beings, and the language that we use to communicate with each other should reflect our recognition of that inherent value. The next few slides are really just a presentation of our references. So at this point, we're done with the formal part of the presentation, and we welcome any questions that you may have. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for such a great presentation, both of you. Very informative, and I think as we, move forward to a more diverse and inclusive world, this type of research will definitely help us do that in the pockets that need adjustment and changing. So thank you for that. As folks get their questions going, I do have a few questions for you both. As people type in their questions if they have any. But what were your main takeaways from the research study itself?
Cheryl, you can start with the answer.
Okay. So the main takeaway from what I had seen was that once teachers were made aware of what the definition of microaggression was, then it put everything that they observed in the classroom in a different lens. Some of the teachers that were working with elementary and middle school students were thinking, oh, that's just kids are kids type of behavior. And when they were very thoughtful in their observation, then they realized that, yes, that is microaggressive behavior either as an insult or it was a physical type of thing. Sometimes the kids were doing it unintentionally, but if it was not checked, then it started to become intentional. So it started to be, you know, a little shove here or a little slight insult. And if the child felt that they could get away with it, then they would continue to pick on their victim. So then they ended up being a perpetrator. So what ended up happening was the teachers really then sat back and they re-examined those type of small classroom behaviors and then realized that they really needed to take care of them. Andrea, do you have anything to add?
Actually, I'd like to just add that the teachers also brought up the idea of microaggression as being something that is a precursor, almost like pre-bullying, to where if they don't step in and do something about it at the level of microaggression, that they do run the risk of the behavior continuing and escalating to the level of what we would call bullying, which may be more severe or include types of violence that are physical and more detrimental. So it was interesting to me how the teachers really saw microaggression, how it can be not only its own behavior, but it's also a behavior that could lead to more serious behavior that we would call bullying in the classroom.
That's really interesting. Thank you all for that. We do have a couple of questions. From Marcia asks, how do kids learn microaggressions?
Well, that's an interesting concept, and it actually comes from our research and not only the literature review, but also speaking with teachers. Much of that comes from, I would say, in three different areas. One, it's the behaviors that are allowed in the household. So it is modeled behavior, either between parents or siblings. So a younger sibling models whatever the older sibling is doing. And it is not put in check at home. So if, say the parents at home do not like a specific ethnic group and then they use slurs against that ethnic group, then that information is brought to the school. The student or the child believes then that's okay, that language is okay. Then when they see somebody that represents that group at school, they will use that verbal insult or slang towards that particular student. Another area is social media. It was brought up. We didn't delve into just a study on social media and microaggression in and of itself could be a paper, but social media plays a big role. Again, students and young adults are very susceptible to role models that they see, and those could be influencers in social media or movie stars or sports stars. And again, those individuals that model inappropriate behavior, the student believes that that's okay, and then they will go ahead and use that same type of behavior. And then also when it occurs in school, one student sees another one doing it, no one disciplines them or calls them out for it, so they think it's okay. And so again, it is that it just continuously moves forward that you have, when behaviors are unchecked, students think those are okay behaviors. So the teacher needs to be aware of that. In some cases, yes, there's a lot of pressure on teachers to make sure that content is taken care of, but you also need to take care of, as one of our teachers had said, is we really need to take care of the social emotional behaviors, mental health and wellness of our students. And you need to make sure you have time in your day in each classroom to check in with students to make sure that they are being educated as a whole individual and that they feel safe and welcomed in that environment.
Awesome, thank you. To what extent are microaggressive behaviors learned from parents? And if it is learned at home to a great extent, what hope is there for long-term change resulting from the intervention of teachers?
I'll take this question.
Okay.
As Cheryl just mentioned, we know from not only from our research and what our participants said, but also from the literature, that the home environment is probably the greatest influence on what behaviors students bring to school, especially the youngest students. And again, that sort of bolsters our opinion that we need to focus specifically on elementary schools or elementary students and what they bring to schools. Ultimately, as with anything that we do in the classroom, it's the starting place. If we can teach the students how to be respectful and kind and understanding of others in the classrooms, whether it be towards the teacher to student or student to students or others, the children bring that home. And they can influence the home life in the same way that the home life will influence them. And if they're unable to influence what's going on at home, they can at least take into their own lives as they grow up, knowing better, because ultimately we can only do better when we know how to do better. And that, to me, as an educator at heart, that to me is prompted by the school environment and what we're able to do as teachers and educators in that environment.
Thank you all. This is a similar question, but if it brings about any other responses, please feel free. And I believe this should be our last question. We're right at time. If kids are modeling outside behavior, how can teachers oppose what students are bringing with them? I know that's a little similar, but does anything else jump out to either of you with that question?
I would just say that teachers can bring it to light. Remember, as we said, awareness and understanding is the key to this. And so if teachers don't tolerate, if they don't ignore the behavior, if they bring awareness to the behavior, that's the first step in creating real change.
Thank you. Thank you, Marsha and Maria, for your questions. Thank you both, Dr. Burley and Wilson, for your research and your being agents of social change. Thank you, everyone, and we look forward to having you at another session.
All right. Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for coming. Bye-bye.